Yes, we've learned through court records that the victim, Ruben Chavez, and the suspect, Princess Perez, were exes fighting over child custody. And the deputy DA says that Perez was there during the shooting and she fled along with her boyfriend, drove her boyfriend across the border, and then they returned at the San Ysidro port of entry, and that's where they were arrested. The deputy DA says that Perez, again, was part of all this as an accessory to murder. The courtroom today was filled with the victim's family and friends, but they're just not ready to comment.
What do you think is happening when three babies are sitting silently in a van at 12:30 in the morning with no adults in sight? Because on January 19, 2026, near the intersection of 27th Street and Imperial Avenue in San Diego, that question became the first crack in a story that would eventually leave 9 children without parents. An anonymous caller contacted police just after midnight. The voice didn't ramble, it didn't explain. It simply reported 2 people lying in the street. No names. No urgency in the tone, just enough information to force officers to respond. At first, this kind of call usually points to something mundane, maybe a hit and run, maybe a fight that went too far. But the moment patrol units arrived, that assumption collapsed. 2 bodies were lying on the pavement, a man and a woman. Both had suffered gunshot wounds. Both were already gone. The street was quiet in that unsettling way that only comes after violence has already finished saying what it needed to say. The victims were identified as Ruben Chavez, 31 years old, and Evelyn Virgen, 28. They weren't strangers, they were together, and they weren't supposed to be there alone. As officers secured the scene, something nearby pulled their attention. A van, parked close enough to matter. Inside were 3 children, all under the age of 2. No injuries, no visible distress, just sitting there, alive, unharmed, and completely unaware that their mother was lying dead less than 20 feet away. That discovery changed everything. Because this was no longer just a double homicide, it was a crime that happened in the presence of children. Children who couldn't run, children who couldn't scream for help, children who survived simply because whoever pulled the trigger decided to walk away instead of finishing the scene. And that decision raises a question investigators couldn't ignore. Who commits a killing knowing babies are that close and still believes they're justified? Shell casings scattered across the asphalt pointed to a shotgun, not a distant weapon, not something fired from the shadows. This was close, deliberate, personal. Whoever did this stood near Ruben and Evelyn and made sure there would be no second chances. Yet despite the brutality, there was no chaos left behind, no suspect waiting, no frantic explanation, just silence, bodies, and 3 children sitting quietly in a van that never should have been part of this scene. As detectives began digging into Ruben Chavez's life, one detail surfaced almost immediately, something that reframed the entire night. A custody battle, a court fight that hadn't stayed inside the courtroom. And the deeper they looked, the clearer it became that what happened on that street didn't start at midnight. It started months earlier, with paperwork, restrictions, and a family court decision that quietly lit the fuse. What does it do to a person when the system meant to protect families slowly convinces them they're a danger to their own children? For Ruben Chavez, the fight didn't happen in the street first. It happened in family court, on paper, in rooms where voices are lowered, decisions are stamped, and consequences don't show themselves until much later. Ruben and his ex-girlfriend, Princess Perez, shared children together. When their relationship ended, what followed was familiar and devastatingly common. a custody dispute that refused to settle. Court records show Ruben wanted to be in his kids' lives, not casually, not occasionally. He pushed for joint custody, the kind that lets a parent feel like more than a visitor. But the court didn't see it that way. Instead, Ruben was granted supervised visitation only. Every moment with his own children required another adult in the room. No privacy, no spontaneous fatherhood, no trust. Imagine what that does to someone. You're allowed to show up, but never fully belong. You can love your children, but you're treated like a potential risk. Every visit becomes a reminder that someone else decides how much of a parent you're allowed to be. And while Ruben kept showing up to court dates and following the rules, Princess moved on. She was now in a relationship with Ramses Rex Morales, a 21-year-old man who quickly became part of a new household Ruben wasn't welcome in. Princess and Ramses had a child together. A new family structure formed, one where Ruben was present only on paper and under supervision. Here's where tension turns dangerous, because custody disputes aren't just about time, they're about control, about who gets believed, about who gets erased. And when one parent feels boxed out while watching someone else step into their role, resentment doesn't just simmer, it sharpens. Who really has power when the court picks a side? Ruben kept pushing, more time, more rights, more access, and every denial reinforced the same message: you're not trusted. Meanwhile, Princess held the advantage. She had physical custody, she had the court's backing, and she had a new partner now standing beside her. Then there was Evelyn Virgen. Evelyn wasn't part of the custody fight, but she was pulled into its gravity. She was Ruben's girlfriend, a young mother herself. She had 3 children, all under the age of 2. One of those children was also Ruben's. Evelyn wasn't filing motions or attending hearings. She was just trying to raise babies while standing next to a man fighting to stay in his kids' lives. That made her visible, and in situations like this, visibility can be dangerous. 9 children were now tied to this conflict, 9 lives depending on adults who were locked in a battle that felt increasingly personal. And somewhere along the way, this stopped being about visitation schedules and started becoming something much darker. Because custody disputes usually drag on for years, they don't usually end with shotguns in the street. But by mid-January 2026, something had shifted. Whether it was a conversation, a confrontation, or a decision made quietly behind closed doors, investigators believe this conflict crossed a line. And once it did, there was no pulling it back. Because the next time these 4 adults crossed paths, it wouldn't be in a courtroom. What happens when someone who has never fought the battle suddenly decides how it ends? Ramses Morales was 21 years old, young enough to still be figuring out who he was, but old enough to be pulled into a conflict that had already been burning long before he arrived. He wasn't part of the original relationship. He didn't sit through custody hearings. He didn't hear judges explain why Ruben could only see his children under supervision. But once he became involved with Princess Perez, the dispute didn't stay between exes anymore. It expanded. Princess and Ramses weren't just dating, they shared a child. That fact alone changed the balance of power. What had once been a fractured family became a blended one, and Ruben was watching from the outside. The man fighting through paperwork and court restrictions was now being replaced in real time by someone else, younger, present, living inside the home Ruben couldn't enter. That kind of displacement isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet.
It shows up in subtle ways: who's at the dinner table, who the kids look to, whose voice carries weight. And when someone new steps into a family already under stress, the lines between loyalty and influence can blur fast. Who gets to decide what's fair when emotions start overriding the law? Investigators would later say they don't know exactly what was said between Princess, Ruben, Ramses, and Evelyn in the days leading up to January 19th. There's no verified record of threats, no documented confrontation that night. But absence of evidence doesn't mean absence of pressure. Because the motive prosecutors point to is clear: the custody dispute. And Ramses didn't need to be the one who started it to become the one who ended it. In cases like this, psychology matters. When a person feels like their family is under threat, real or imagined, they can justify actions that would otherwise feel unthinkable. If Ruben was seen as a problem that wouldn't go away, and the courts weren't resolving it fast enough, a dangerous idea can take root. Remove the problem, restore control. Evelyn's presence complicated things even further. She wasn't just Ruben's girlfriend, she was a mother standing close to the conflict. Her children were part of the picture now, and whether intentionally or not, she represented something Princess no longer had: a shared life with Ruben that existed outside courtrooms and supervision logs. That kind of rivalry doesn't have to be spoken out loud to be felt. And then there's the question investigators still can't answer publicly. At what point did discussion turn to decision? Because by the time January 19th arrived, whatever balance once existed between these adults had collapsed. Something had reached a breaking point. Whether it was planned or impulsive remains under investigation. What's certain is this: Ramses didn't just know about the conflict, he walked straight into its most violent chapter. And when midnight came, the meeting that should never have happened finally did. A street, a van, 3 children waiting inside, and in a matter of moments, 2 lives would be erased, while the people responsible were already preparing to run. What kind of meeting happens after midnight when children are brought along, unless someone believed nothing could go wrong? At 12:30 a.m. on January 19, 2026, most of San Diego was asleep. Streets were empty, windows were dark. Near the intersection of 27th Street and Imperial Avenue, the city was quiet in that deceptive way that makes danger harder to see coming. Somewhere in that darkness, Ruben Chavez and Evelyn Virgen arrived with 3 babies still strapped into a van. Why they were there at that hour remains one of the most unsettling parts of this case. Investigators have not publicly confirmed whether the meeting was planned or spontaneous. What is known is that Ruben and Evelyn didn't end up there by accident, and neither did the people who would soon kill them. The encounter didn't last long. A shotgun was used, not a distant weapon, not something fired and forgotten. Shotguns demand proximity. They require the shooter to stand close enough to see who they're aiming at, to recognize faces, to understand exactly what they're about to do. When the shots rang out, Ruben and Evelyn didn't have a chance. By the time police arrived, both were already dead in the street. The violence was swift, final, and then it stopped, abruptly. But the most disturbing part wasn't just how they were killed. It was who was still there when the gunfire ended. Less than 20 feet away sat the van. Inside, 3 children under the age of 2 remained strapped into their seats. They hadn't been struck. They hadn't been moved. Whoever pulled the trigger knew they were there and chose to leave them behind. That decision matters, because it tells investigators this wasn't chaos, it wasn't blind rage. Someone made a conscious choice to walk away after killing 2 adults while leaving babies alive and alone in the dark. What kind of logic allows that distinction? Shell casings scattered across the pavement confirmed the weapon. The street offered no immediate suspect, no argument frozen in time, no frantic call for help from the shooter, just silence, cooling bodies, and 3 children waiting in a van that had suddenly become a crime scene by proximity alone. Officers moved fast. The babies were removed and taken into protective custody. They were unharmed physically, but the damage had already been done. Their mother wasn't coming back, and the father fighting in court just to see his children was gone too. As detectives worked the scene, one thing became obvious very quickly. The people responsible hadn't stuck around to explain themselves. They hadn't called 911. They hadn't waited for help. They hadn't even stayed in the neighborhood. They were already gone. And when investigators started asking the most important question, who had motive to be here tonight, every road led back to the same unresolved conflict: a custody dispute, an ex-girlfriend, and a new boyfriend who had just crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. But fleeing a crime scene is one thing. Deciding to flee the country is another. And by the time detectives confirmed who they were looking for, Princess Perez and Ramses Morales were already heading south.
What does it say about someone's state of mind when their first instinct after a killing isn't to explain, but to disappear? Princess Perez and Ramses Morales didn't wait for police. They didn't stay behind to claim innocence or shock. Instead, they made a decision that investigators interpret as one of the loudest signals of guilt. They fled. And not just across town, not to a friend's couch or a motel off the freeway. They crossed an international border. Sometime after the shootings, Princess and Ramses drove south into Mexico, putting distance between themselves and the crime scene on Imperial Avenue. That choice alone shifted the case from a local homicide to something much bigger. People who believe the truth will protect them usually don't run. People who know the truth could bury them often do. Why run unless you already understand what's coming next? San Diego homicide detectives moved quickly. They already had motive tied to the custody dispute. They had witness information placing Princess and Ramses in the area around the time of the murders, and now they had flight, something courts recognize as consciousness of guilt. But then came the mistake. After entering Mexico, Princess and Ramses didn't stay gone. Whether they thought enough time had passed, whether they believed police hadn't connected the dots yet, or whether they needed to return for their own child, investigators don't know. What they do know is that both suspects attempted to re-enter the United States at the San Ysidro port of entry. That's where everything stopped. U.S. Border Patrol agents detained Princess Perez and Ramses Morales as they tried to cross back into the country. Their names were already on law enforcement radar, and once they were held, San Diego Police Department homicide detectives arrived to do what they hadn't been able to do earlier: ask questions. At the border, there was no street to run down, no darkness to hide in, just fluorescent lights, federal officers, and a growing case that wasn't going away. Detectives began interviewing both suspects. Whatever was said in those rooms hasn't been fully released publicly, but the outcome speaks for itself. The evidence was stacking up.
shell casings from the scene, the custody dispute as motive, witness accounts, and now a documented attempt to flee the country. Running didn't erase the past, it froze it in place. Princess and Ramses were taken into custody. From that point on, this was no longer an unsolved mystery. It was a criminal case moving toward charges that could permanently reshape multiple families. And as investigators prepared arrest paperwork, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't just about what happened in the street. It was about what the law would now do to the people who survived and the children who had no say in any of it. Because once prosecutors stepped in, the consequences weren't theoretical anymore. They were written in counts. And the next question wasn't who did this. It was how much responsibility each person would carry when the courtroom lights turned on.
When 2 people are dead and children left behind, how does the law decide who carries the weight of what happened? Once Princess Perez and Ramses Morales were in custody, prosecutors began laying out the case, carefully, methodically, and with an understanding that every decision would be scrutinized. This wasn't just a double homicide. The presence of children, the weapon used, and the alleged planning elevated everything. Ramses Morales was charged with 2 counts of murder with special circumstances. In California, that language matters. Special circumstances are reserved for cases the state considers especially severe. Multiple victims, aggravated factors, and actions that show a heightened level of culpability. If convicted, Ramses faces the most extreme penalties the state allows. He was also charged with 3 counts of child endangerment. Those charges aren't symbolic. Prosecutors argue that firing a weapon and committing murder while children are present places them in immediate danger, regardless of whether they were physically harmed. The law treats exposure to that risk as its own crime. Princess Perez was charged differently, but no less seriously. She faces charges as an accessory to murder. Prosecutors allege that she was present during the incident and helped Ramses flee the scene afterward, including driving him across the border into Mexico. Under California law, assisting someone after a homicide makes you criminally liable, even if you didn't pull the trigger yourself. But prosecutors were careful to say one thing out loud. Her role is still under investigation. That distinction matters, because accessory charges can change. If evidence emerges that Princess played a larger role in planning or facilitating the murders, the charges could be upgraded. That possibility hangs over the case and over her future. Both defendants were ordered held without bail. In court, a judge ordered their faces blurred during media coverage. The courtroom itself was filled with the victim's family and friends, people trying to process how a custody dispute ended with funerals instead of visitation schedules. And then there are the children. The 3 babies found in the van were placed into protective custody and later with family members. Ruben's children were also placed with relatives. 9 children in total were suddenly relocated, moved between homes, routines shattered, futures rewritten by decisions they didn't make. How do you explain to a child that their parent isn't coming home when the truth is too heavy to say out loud? Court dates were scheduled. A preliminary hearing was set. Prosecutors referred to the case as complicated, avoiding public speculation about motive beyond what evidence supported. They were careful, because in cases like this, every word matters. Justice, if it comes, will come slowly. But justice doesn't restore what was taken. And as this case moves through the system, one question continues to linger beneath every charge and legal term. Even if the court delivers the harshest sentence possible, what does that actually mean
for the 9 children left behind.
What happens to children when the adults responsible for protecting them destroy everything instead? This case doesn't end in a courtroom. It doesn't end with a verdict or a sentence, no matter how severe. It ends in living rooms that now feel emptier, in bedrooms where parents never come back, and in the quiet confusion of children trying to understand a world that changed overnight. 9 children woke up on January 19th with parents. By the end of that day, their lives were split apart. 3 of them were babies who will never remember their mother's voice. They'll never know the sound of Evelyn Virgen calling their names, never feel her hold them after a long night. Their memories of her won't come from experience. They'll come from stories told by relatives trying to preserve something that violence erased. Ruben Chavez's children will grow up knowing their father fought to be in their lives, that he went through courtrooms and supervision rules just to spend time with them. And yet, the system that restricted him couldn't protect him. The visits he was allowed were limited. The future he was asking for never arrived. Princess Perez and Ramses Morales also share a child together. That child will grow up carrying a different weight, the knowledge that their father faces the most severe penalties the law allows, and that their mother is accused of helping him escape after 2 people were killed. That's not a burden a child chooses. It's one they inherit. Family members have stepped in, aunts, uncles, grandparents, people doing their best to create stability out of chaos. But stability doesn't erase loss. It just teaches children how to live with it. Custody battles happen every day. They fill court calendars across the country. Parents argue over schedules, holidays, supervision, control. Most of those disputes stay where they belong, inside legal documents and tense conversations. This one didn't. It spilled into the street. It involved a shotgun, and it left babies sitting alone in a van after midnight. The case is still moving through the legal system. Ramses Morales awaits trial, facing charges that could cost him his life. Princess Perez waits to see whether the charges against her remain the same or become much heavier. Prosecutors continue to investigate, and families continue to grieve. There are no clean endings here. No outcome will bring Ruben and Evelyn back. No sentence will undo what 9 children lost in a single night, and no court ruling can fix the moment when adults chose violence over restraint. This didn't start with gunfire. It started with resentment, with control, with a custody dispute that never left the courtroom. And long after the headlines fade, the quiet consequences will remain, carried by children who had no voice in any of it.